Give me a city, for a society to progress, for there to be any semblance of development, for there to be at least some comfort of governance, a people must be self-governing, and the very place to start must be at the township level, and without parochial interferences from the states or the colonial masters from Abuja. Let's start from first principles. Let's govern ourselves at the village and township levels first. Think again. I always find it amusing when I observe our state governors in Nigeria attempt to play the almighty. Yes, I'm quite aware that they've been sold the lie by the 1999 constitution that they could solve all problems within their states. But it's one thing to be lied to and another to actually believe the lies, and the state governors actually believe those constitutional lies. How could a state governor actually believe that he could fix every single road in all villages, towns and cities in his state? Provide electricity, healthcare, schools, public housing and more. How could he ever think that he could fix all the potholes, fix drains, install sewers and more across his state? So a large state like Niger, which is the size of the Netherlands, believes that he could solve problems from Minna to Suleja or Jeba, or a densely populated state as Imo with over 100 average-sized towns would have the governor believing he could modernize every single township from Owerri to Olu, Ikuru, Aro, Idizogu, Oguta, Obokofia, Ukwere and more. How? No, it is impossible, but that's what that silly constitution says, and all the state governors adhere to that silly provision like imbeciles. Couldn't you think for yourselves? How do you bring your state from the third world to the first from your paltry allocations and poorer IGR and hope to turn Kaba to Kentucky, with this model? Insanity. The cities must govern themselves and be responsible for their own development. The constitution is stupid, but are the governors so stupid too? Maybe they really are, and we always expect too much. Oga Governor, you cannot develop the state beyond the stipulated mediocre level of that silly constitution. For there to be real and accelerated growth, you must pass legislation for the villages, towns and cities to be self-governing. If you want help on this, we could give you for free, but playing God and believing you could do it as per the fraud called constitution is determined stupidity. Quit being stupid and think again. I'm appalled that quite a lot of Nigerians, and indeed most Africans, do not realize that the world-class cities they see in Southeast Asia, Europe, North and South America, were not built by, nor are they governed by the state, regional or federal governments of the parent countries. Those cities were built, and are governed by the residents of the cities themselves. No, development and governance in those cities were not happenstance but deliberate and organic processes. And no, the government and development of those cities were not from their federal governments but by the residents of the cities themselves. No, the elections of the city governments were not by a certain federal-controlled INEC or subject to the shenanigans of a president. The residents determined their own elections. No, they do not depend on some nebulous federal allocations and do not exist at the whims of a governor or premier. No, their security is not by some nefarious federal police force nor military but municipal police, trained, recruited and paid for by the residents of the cities themselves. Yes, they build subways, high-rises, hospitals, libraries, museums, schools, power plants, water plants and so much more that they fund in partnership with the private sector themselves. Yes, they have their own municipal courts and are responsible for the delivery of justice within their municipalities themselves and prevent the federal, regional or state governments from interferences. Yes, New York, Vancouver, Manchester, Berlin, Shanghai, Tokyo, Sao Paulo, etc. were built and governed by the residents of the cities themselves. Yes, the sum total of the progress of those cities have direct consequences on the progress of the countries. And no, Nigeria could never progress by preventing the villages, towns and cities from governing themselves, and yes, the poverty and disorderliness in the villages, towns and cities in Nigeria is a direct reflection of the tragedy of the Nigerian state. To progress, we must be directly responsible for the progress. A nefarious constitution that prevents this must be toppled. The Nigerian state should allow us to govern ourselves at the local level, and would do well to get out of the way, make we fit the front. In history, almost all countries were formed by the agglomeration of willing city governments. The very foundation of the stable countries worldwide are the cities. We shall employ a couple of examples to buttress the point here. Greece was formed as a result of city-states within the same area, that collaborated to create an enduring country now known as Greece. There had been Sparta, Athens, Crete, and so many more where the cities were actually city-states, complete with all accoutrements of statehood. Each city had a king, a senate, and a cabinet that piloted the affairs of the city. They developed public facilities from windmills and aqueducts that channeled potable water to the populace, markets, security, the works. They had judges, prisons, libraries, and so much more. These cities had ambassadors, emissaries, in other cities, and existed virtually as countries. Over the time, as the need arose, the cities evolved and formed some loose associations among themselves, especially as regards the aggression of the Persians, now Iranians, and slowly evolved to form a country. In the establishment of the country, the uniqueness of each was not jettisoned, rather got stronger, and now the very basis of the country called Greece, Florence, Milan, Rome, Venice, etc. were all city-states one time that existed just like the Grecian cities. Of course, the city of Rome became extremely powerful, especially during the reign of Julius Caesar. Caesar, being a most accomplished general, rallied the other cities to establish the Roman Empire, of which the remnant is the country now known as Italy. So great was Rome to the point that the name Caesar became a title across Europe. Kaiser among the Germanic tribes and Caesar in Russia. Those titles simply meant Caesar. That's how great a city as Rome was. And the rallying of the city of Rome is the country called Italy today. Now let's come back home to the Nigerian cities, towns and villages too. Who governs our cities? The cities have zero government, and in the absence of government at the city level, what has been the result? Chaos. The fraudulent system established by the 1999 Constitution has convinced the people that the state governors were responsible for the cities, rather than state governments to reject this fraud. They actually have been attempting, albeit in vain, to run the cities, and they have been failing for decades. The Nigerian cities are a pigsty, cesspools of misery and retrogression, where area boys and touts create fiefdoms and terrorize regular folks, where a huge refuse dump could be at the city center and public housing non-existent. Where no one knows who should be in charge of the schools or hospitals or who should be responsible for public security and prosperity. Erroneously, we have all assumed the governors should be in charge. No one is in charge. The villages, towns and cities are without governments and have collapsed, but who's talking about these? Little do people realize that the very core of development of a country is at the city and township levels. Our cities could never develop if we didn't govern them, and no country could develop without allowing the people to govern themselves at the local level. No matter what we do in Nigeria, without allowing us to govern ourselves in our small enclaves, there would never be real or sustainable development in Nigeria, and Nigeria would continue to exist in vain. And this is a fact. Allow us to govern us, Bikonu, think again. Quite many folks around here assume that the federal and state governments should be responsible for the villages, towns and cities. That's a very erroneous disposition. It's an abominable lie. The residents of a locality must be responsible for their development. Never mind the nefarious lie told by a fraudulent constitution. You must be responsible for the development of your locality, and you must fund it, okay? So whether there would be a Biafra, an Oduduwa, or autonomous regions or whatever, for there to be any profound changes that would bring about some awesome development and project us from the third world to the first world, we must all be responsible for the development of our localities in the first place. And that is a fact and in alignment with the natural order of things. So I see folks turning up their noses in derision at the philosophy of being responsible for own development. Yes, this is as a result of having been programmed by a demonic structure. I'm sorry to announce to you that in whatever enclave you find yourselves, either as autonomous regions or independent countries, you would never succeed in the mission until people govern themselves at the local level in the first instance. There's no going round it. The Biafra, Oduduwa or the autonomous regions would never succeed without self-government at the local level, and the Nigerian state has been a colossal failure due to their inability to allow the locals to govern themselves. So as you agitate for independence or autonomous regions, you must present a model that works at the local level so as to bring everyone on stream and make everyone a stakeholder. Anything other than that would spell doom. Okay, but then, why don't we start right away? Why don't we force the hands of the governors to allow, encourage and legislate that all local levels should commence self-governing while the state governments would see to a uniform policy of municipal governance? That's some food for thought, so think again. Do we even realize that the prevention of municipal governance by the nefarious Constitution of 1999 is a major drawback to individual personal development? Do you realize the quantum of business opportunities that could be unleashed by simply having municipal governments? Do you know that unemployment alone could be halved by the advent of municipal government? Do you even know the profound effects on municipal, regional and national GDP? Well, you may not realize this, but municipal governments in a city could employ as many as 1,000 persons in direct employment and over 5,000 persons indirectly. Compound that by about 750 large towns and cities in Nigeria and see how many persons would be employed. Compound that by an average of 120k per month and see what they would be pulling in salaries and wages. Compound that by an average of 10% and see the multiplier effects on the local economy. Do you even realize that in spite of the insanity of a national constitution, self-government at the local level cushions the residents from the worst policies of a region or central regime? Without governing ourselves at the local level, and sponsoring ourselves, we'd continue to be exposed to the whims and caprices of the Neanderthals of the federal government. Let's save ourselves and our children. Let's govern ourselves at the local level and quit the madness introduced by the 1999 fraud called Constitution. Save yourselves, people. Think again. Quite a large percentage of the citizens are oblivious to the fact that they must be responsible for the development of their villages, towns and cities. Quite many people are unaware of the fact that these enclaves are their primary responsibilities. We have researched and we have incontrovertible data to that attest to this. Many Nigerians are aghast at the idea of them governing themselves and sponsoring government, at least at the municipal level. What could be responsible for this? Since 1970, after the unfortunate genocide called Civil War, the Decree 34 of May 1966 came into full force, and municipal governance alongside regional governments came to a screeching halt. The unitary system was being systematically implemented, and codified as the 1979 and 1999 constitutions. The structural framework of the Nigerian state slowly but surely got eroded, so folks have been so programmed for 50 years to view the federal government as the alpha and the omega. The federal government took over all affairs of the entity called Nigeria and programmed hitherto progressive people to be blabbering dependents and never-do-wells. Most citizens simply lost the ability to fend for selves, so did the municipalities just collapse their very existence into the nefarious structure. So the average Nigerian has been programmed to depend on the federal government for existence, thereby becoming endangered species in the lands of their forefathers. So we always wonder how folks could think that by having a Biafra, an Oduduwa Republic or autonomous regions, that everything would be alright without the indigenous people being in charge of themselves at the villages, towns and cities. Whoever told you this would be telling you lies. In any enclave we would find ourselves, we must be responsible for ourselves at the local level. So however much you might think that the current National Socialism could be continued in independent states or in autonomous regions, we put it to you here and now that it would never be so. We must be in charge of ourselves in our localities, and neither the federal nor state governments could help us there. If we must be in charge of ourselves at the national level, we must first take the initiative at the lower level. It's time to stop deceiving ourselves. Take charge of your locality and establish a municipal government today. There's no avoiding it. Think again. So we got together and made me the mayor of a city. What do I do to make the city great? As mayor, I must have the following. 1. Secretary of Education. 2. Secretary of Infrastructure. 3. Secretary of Commerce. 4. Secretary of Agriculture. 5. Secretary of Sports. 6. Secretary of Public Health. 7. Secretary of City Planning. 8. Chief Security Officer. 9. Chief Judge of the Municipality. 10. Chief Tax Officer. 12. Office of Intergovernmental Relations, that would be the cabinet, but there must be a parliament through which the powers of the executive must be derived. So we look at all the villages and clans making up the city and propose that 2 reps each must be presented by each village or clan as reps. The parliament must adhere to the constitution agreed to by all the villages and clans on how the municipality must be governed, and we have a city government in place already, ready to roll. Stay with us and we shall discuss on how each of the 10 ministries could help reduce local employment to the barest minimum. It's no rocket science, whether in a Biafra, Oduduwa or the autonomous regions, we must still do this, so why not start already? From the last update, the Municipal Executive Council shall comprise of 12 NOS members. These 12 members shall be essentially chosen from the municipal parliament, which shall be a minimum of 12 persons depending on how large the village, town or city could be. A city as large as Onitsha might have as many as 50 persons in parliament, while a smaller one like Offa could have just about 15 persons. The idea would be to get an optimum number that gives a fair representation of the people. In Rwanda, every 10 homes has a leader selected in the city. That's their model and it's working wonders for them. The cities decide on how they could be governed and every home contributes to the development of the city. A major concern here shall be residency. For one to be qualified to be elected into the city municipal council, we must have the best. The qualifications shall be 1. One must be above 25 years. 2. One must be a graduate of a higher institution at a minimum. 3. One must have worked in an organization of repute for at least 7 years. 4. One must have attained a position of authority with proven track records of success. 5. One must have been a resident of the municipal area for at least 5 years. 6. One must not have criminal records. 7. One must not be a member of a cult or an occult. Those shall be the recommended basic requirements enshrined in the municipal charter and constitution. With these, we would have commenced a semblance of sanity at the city level. My dear friends, there's no way the federal or state governments would do this for us. We've got to do this ourselves, whether in Biafra, Oduduwa, or the autonomous regions. From the Chapter 8 of this series, we could observe that there would be about 12 NOS ministries for per municipality. Each of them would have to be manned for effective execution of policies, and the manning level shall be dependent on the size of the city and the scope of policies. So for an average city like Asaba comprising of about 700,000 persons, the average department might employ about 25 NOS persons, while the Department of Security would employ an extra circa 300 NOS more persons as the local police. The Department of Education would be in charge of primary and secondary education and might have up to 10 NOS primary schools and 4 NOS secondary schools, thus resulting in the need to man those schools. If the average primary school had 50 NOS teaching and non-teaching staff while the secondary schools had about 70 NOS personnel, that would be a total of 780 NOS persons. The Department of Public Works would be recommended for direct labor and PPP such that direct and indirect jobs would be pushing over 500 persons. The Department of Justice must have about 2 to 3 municipal courts with a judge or magistrate per court complete with bailiffs and court clerks, thus employing at least 15 persons per court, and yes, a municipal jail to keep offenders, those that break the municipal laws, which must be manned by at least 20 NOS personnel. Or do we speak of a public library and museum that must be manned by at least 20 persons too? From the foregoing, it could easily be seen that by the establishment of the municipal governments, the average city would have employed at least 3,000 persons to effectively run the municipality. Now compound these figures for at least 200 fairly large towns and cities in Nigeria with population of over 50,000 persons. How many people would have been theoretically employed directly? 600,000 persons, 600k direct jobs. The rule of thumb says that for every single direct jobs created in public service, there would be at least 4 indirect jobs. A public case of from zero to hero. Do we realize this at all? Hey God, so we scream on employment while seated on opportunities that could unleash the value chain of job creation by simply tapping into an obvious resource that could unleash the potentials of a people. My dear friends, the best of the municipal opportunities is yet to be displayed. The vast economic impact of establishing municipal governments is yet to be seen, and we reckon that the advent of this could double the GDP in less than 5 years and change the economic dynamics of a people almost immediately. We are sitting on a gold mine. Let's start digging, people. Every right-thinking individual ought to be extremely concerned about the prevailing poverty level in these climes. The poverty is fueled by the high unemployment rate, the lack of opportunities, mostly as a result of the unfortunate structure of the polity by a nefarious constitution. We have been able to deduce, however, that the unemployment rate could be greatly reduced by simply establishing the municipal councils, as was observed by a cerebral discussant. Would we just employ folks into the council just because we wanted to reduce the unemployment, whereby personnel would be doing exactly nothing while pulling salaries, thereby worsening an already unwieldy civil service? Hell no, each department of government must be self-funding. The charter of the council must be so agreed that the council shall run on a social capitalist model of a business entity on a profit and loss basis. The profits shall be employed for the development of the council in the spirit of social works. Thus, each department should be so organized to generate its own funding by law, pay the personnel and take care of overheads not exceeding 20% recommended of the gross revenues of the department. With this proviso, a department could not just hire personnel at will but must be tied to the P&L so as to free up 80% of the revenues for municipal development. There shall be no free lunch. The total recommended overhead per department shall not exceed 20%. With this, the issue of financial corruption is reduced to a minimum, while increasing productivity. A department that doesn't adhere to this goes into administration, and the council reserves the rights to dissolve it and bring in new persons. So you see, with the absence of the ubiquitous allocations from the center, each department is now forced to organize itself as a business entity. For a department to succeed, it would bring in its best and nepotism is reduced to a minimum while there'd be 80% of the earnings for development. This is the scientific model of public administration employed in sane climes, and it's possible to do it here, at least at the municipal level. But how does the department earn revenues? Stay with us, but think again, it is possible. Governments at all levels in the current structure of Nigeria wring their hands and complain bitterly and continually about the acute lack of funds to fund the government or develop the country and counties. Most times, we find this both pitiful and hilarious at the same time. The structure, as established by the 1999 Constitution, has made it almost impossible for wealth to be created. Rather than thinking outside the box and redesigning the polity to encourage wealth creation, they batten down on sharing petrodollars for as long as the oil would flow. Little do they realize that wealth could be created internally by simply allowing the structure to evolve on the original arrangements before 1860. Before the advent of the British and the current unfortunate structure, most people were comfortable and the villages, towns and cities were actually rich. But the structure has made them poor. Is that not an indication that this structure impoverishes, but they'd rather die with it rather than change it? It is ridiculous that a local government would wait 30 days to receive federal allocation of circa 200 meters naira when it could generate 3 BN naira on its own to fund its own development. Is it not absolutely disheartening that a city that could generate 2 BN naira monthly on her own waits forever for the state or federal government to provide her with a development of 50 meters per annum? How could we expect to share our way into wealth and development? Insanity. In the next episode, we shall discuss how the average city could generate wealth enough on her own to have an annual budget that could almost equal that of a state as currently constituted. Stay with us, think again.